have David Finnegan Hosey, who is one of the authors, hang on, from our book that we learned about yesterday that some of you have gotten in the mail. David is going to talk to us about sharing stories to change the world, mental health struggles in our ministry. And so David, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, and good to see you all and to be gathered with you in the spirit today. My name is David. I'm the college chaplain at Barton College, which is a small Disciples of Christ affiliated school here in Eastern North Carolina. But I'm here today to talk a little less about that specific ministry context and a bit more about the way that college students taught me how to tell the truth about mental health struggles. I am going to be sharing a little bit about my own experience with mental illness today. So I'm going to talk about bipolar disorder. I'm going to talk a little bit, though not in great detail, about self-harm and suicidal ideation. Those are topics that can be difficult. And so I just want to name that to begin with. And just to invite you to be gentle with yourself if these are topics that touch a difficult place for you. Feel free to, take time, return to a grounding exercise, step away if you need to. This is about inviting all of our stories into this space. I want to take you back to 2011. I had just finished my first year at seminary in Washington, D.C., and found myself, with the help of some friends, checking myself into the psychiatric unit at Sibley Hospital in Washington, D.C. I had a great first year of seminary, really loved it, loved this new community I was making, loved all these new things that I was learning, but for some reason or another, it just felt like I crashed into that summer. And that while outside and externally, everything seemed to be going pretty great in my life, internally, it felt like everything was coming apart at the seams. And so I found myself for the first time in this situation of hospitalization, of seeking out a diagnosis, of trying out all of these different medications. A few weeks later, I was out of the hospital, and then a couple weeks later back in, and then out and in an outpatient program for a little while, and then a few weeks later back in, and eventually a longer term hospitalization in out of state, in upstate Connecticut. And came back after a total of about 6 months in and out of the hospital with this new diagnosis of bipolar disorder. That was something that I had to wrap my already a bit challenged head around, right? I had some new medications and some new therapeutic techniques to try to stabilize that baseline, try to give me some solid ground to stand on in the midst of this really intense emotional storm that had been raging on and off for more than half a year at that point. And I came back to Washington, D.C., and things were just really hard for a really long time. I was more stable, I was safer, I had some new tools, things were tough. During that same time, I had the opportunity to start working with a group of students at a nearby university. It was what was supposed to be my seminary internship. I had met some of the student leaders early on in the year, and then I'd kind of disappeared for about 6 months. So I come back and I start working with them again, which is great because it gives me kind of some purpose and some reason for dragging myself out of bed in the morning. And working with these students, and felt like I owed some sort of explanation for why I had just been AWOL for about 6 months, and lying seemed like it would be really exhausting. And so I gave a sermon at one of our Thursday night worship services, and I shared a little bit about my experience in the hospital and preached on this wonderful passage from John's Gospel where Jesus calls the disciples his friends. And I just raised the question, if Jesus has friends, does Jesus maybe know something of what it means to be lonely? And talked about the loneliness of the experience of the hospital, and also the importance of friendship in the midst of this struggle. And my hope was to kind of, make some meaning out of this experience, and then we could move on. The students would know I was okay, and we'd get back to the work of ministry that we were supposed to be doing together. And of course, that's not what happened. Of course, students started coming to me one at a time and saying things like, hey, I really struggle with anxiety and depression. or I have a family member who has a really severe mental illness. It's hard on them and it's hard on our family. Or I have a friend or a roommate who is just going through this really painful time right now. We're not sure what to call it or what name to put on it, and we're not sure what to do. And we didn't know we could talk about it in church. But now you have. So now we know that we can. So this was a revelation for me, and the first lesson, that by going first, by sharing with some vulnerability and some authenticity about the very real and difficult and painful experience of a mental health crisis, I was able to create a space for other people to share difficult stories that perhaps in the past they had received the message, whether consciously, overtly, or perhaps unconsciously, that they maybe weren't allowed to talk about that in church. That stories that had previously been silenced and stigmatized were now welcome in this space. And so this was an invitation then into a learning for me about how to do that well, to try to do that well, to try to share this story, to try to go first, to create space for faith communities, to be talking about mental health struggles. And in that talking about mental health struggles, to perhaps rediscover ourselves as a community where we bring our whole selves to God and each other, and there find ourselves loved and accepted and welcomed by God's grace. Now, around the same time that I'm talking about, where I was learning how to tell this story, I learned something new. I learned that I had a pre-existing condition. My insurance company informed me of this fact in a very friendly letter that they sent me to tell me that because I have a pre-existing condition, that they actually wouldn't be helping me pay for any of these hospitalizations that had occurred over the past 6 months. Surprise. And so suddenly I found myself in debt, like a lot of debt, like tens of thousands of dollars of medical debt. It weighed on me. It weighed on any thoughts or planning about the future. My monthly payment on this debt, if I wanted to keep debt collectors off of my back, was more than my monthly rent in Washington, D.C., which, if you've ever tried to live in Washington, D.C., is like a lot of money. And a little administrative hiccup or a missed payment on my part would send me into this bureaucratic spiral. And so very quickly, I learned a second lesson, that in the United States, dealing with the mental health care system can be as much of a mental health challenge as the bipolar disorder that I had found myself newly diagnosed with. So second lesson learned, as we start telling these difficult stories and start facilitating a community of story sharing and story stewardship, we are very quickly going to find ourselves moving from individual stories of mental health struggle into conversations about a bigger, broader system that impinges on and sometimes prevents access to care for the people in that struggle. Now, around this same time, this same difficult time where I'm learning to tell this story, I learned a third thing. This time I'm sitting in a therapist's office, and she is introducing me to a form of group therapy that I'm going to be participating in. It's like a therapist's office out of a movie. Her voice is very soft. The light is very soft. There's soft music, and somehow there's soft water flowing in the background. And the therapist says to me, "I'm glad you're here. We don't usually have men in these groups." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Why do you suppose that is?" And she said, "Well, I know why that is. That's because most men with your diagnosis are in jail." So the third lesson, as we begin learning to create communities of story sharing and story stewardship, communities where it is in fact okay to talk about challenging things, mental health struggle, the reality is that for far too many people in this country, mass incarceration and chronic homelessness and policing have replaced a functioning mental health care system. And so if I'm going to tell my story of mental health struggle and create space for other people to tell their stories of mental health struggle, we also need to be participating in this much bigger conversation that is about the spider web of systems surrounding the mental health care system. And the way that that spider web of systems not only prevents access for many people, but in fact commits violence against many people. That my story and this broader story and that bigger, deeper, wider conversation are connected, and that an individual story needs to be an entry point, not the end, but the beginning of the conversation we need to be having about mental health in our faith communities and outside of our walls. Which makes me think about this one little verse in the Gospel of Mark. It's in the 6th chapter of Mark. And before this one little verse, the disciples have had some rough times. They have watched Jesus get rejected by his hometown. Not so great for the movement. They've been sent out to perform ministry and healing and mission, but have learned that John the Baptist, a friend of the movement, has been executed by the powers that be. And so they come back from their mission and their ministry and their work of healing in an anxious time, a time of challenge and of pain and of overt violence. Just after this little verse, the disciples are going to witness Jesus turning a situation of scarcity into one of abundance, the feeding of the 5,000. And right in between those two realities, the gospel writer says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. I didn't notice it myself, and I'll be honest that I don't remember who pointed it out to me, that the verse says that the apostles told Jesus all they had done and taught. All of it. Which, consistent with the Gospel of Mark, and it's not exactly flattering portrayal of the apostles, probably included failure and struggle and doubt and pain. And so I like to think about this gathering of the apostles, sitting around Jesus, perhaps sitting around a fire, telling it all, sharing the joys and the struggles, the challenges and the celebrations of life together in ministry and in community and in struggle. And then seeing how that community of story sharing and story caring and story stewardship is led out into the world to meet the needs that are so present just there outside of that little circle. What if we can create those types of communities on campuses, in parishes, in our neighborhoods? What if we are called to be that community of story sharing and story stewardship that then goes out and changes the world? And so the thing that I thought I was doing with those students, telling them I was okay so we could get back to the work of ministry to which we had been called, turned out to be the ministry, that bringing of our sacred stories together and leading us out to meet those needs, to change the world. If that's not church, I don't know what is.